Inside Tamms Correctional Center, world's deadliest inmates and gang secrets exposed. The arrival of Tams, a fortress of isolation. In 1998, a new prison opened in Illinois that would become a symbol of brutality, isolation, and the unrelenting power of the gang networks inside. It was designed to hold the deadliest criminals, but its methods would spark a national outcry that still echoes today. When you think of maximum security prisons, the image that might come to mind is one of towering walls, barbed wire, and the echo of guards' boots on cold concrete floors. But at Tamms Correctional Center, there was something more chilling, a silence so deep it felt suffocating, the kind only the worst criminals ever knew. Tamms, located in the remote southern tip of Illinois, was no ordinary prison. It was designed to hold the nation's most dangerous inmates, those who couldn't fit anywhere else. It wasn't just a place for punishment, it was a place meant to break you, to isolate you in ways no human being should ever be. The facility, which opened its gates in 1998, was part of the United States' growing experiment in Supermax prisons, high-security institutions built to lock away the worst of the worst. The prison's creators had a vision. Tamms would be a fortress, an institution so secure that it could contain even the most violent offenders. And to do so, they implemented one of the most severe isolation regimens in the world. Inmates were placed in solitary confinement for 23 hours a day, a regimen that forced them into the kind of isolation few can imagine. With only an hour of outdoor exercise each day, these men were deprived of almost everything: human interaction, the warmth of sunlight, even the comforting sound of another voice. The only sounds in their cells were their own breathing and the clatter of their shackles as they paced in the small space. It was here, inside these concrete walls, that some of the country's most notorious criminals would meet their fate. Men with names that would become synonymous with violence, men whose reputations preceded them even in the darkest corners of the prison system. Among them were notorious gang leaders, men whose reach extended far beyond the razor wire of Tamms. But it wasn't just the inmates inside who were suffering. Outside, the public began to take notice. Human rights groups like the ACLU launched campaigns to shut down Tamms, citing the irreversible mental damage caused by long-term solitary confinement. They argued that the conditions violated human dignity and human rights, but the system was built to ignore those voices. And for the men inside, that silence was their prison. As Tamms grew notorious, so did the power of the gangs. Even in isolation, the inmates managed to maintain control over networks stretching beyond the prison walls. Using coded messages and hidden systems, they orchestrated drug deals, extortions, and murders that carried on without regard for the prison's reinforced walls or its guards. These were men who had learned the rules of survival in the world outside, and they were determined to take those lessons with them inside. But it wasn't just the gang leaders who managed to maintain their influence. Tamms housed men who had been rejected by every other prison for their sheer violence: murderers, armed robbers, and those who had proven time and again they were incapable of rehabilitation. Yet even in their isolation, these men found a way to create a hierarchy, to govern and to manipulate. Inside Tamms, each day became a battle. The guards were overworked, constantly on edge, knowing the slightest mistake could lead to disaster. But even they were powerless against the suffocating grip of isolation. And despite the prison's design to break the spirit, some men still found a way to survive, to thrive, even within the system. As Tamms became a symbol of the harshest form of punishment, it also became the backdrop for a larger story. One that would reveal the limits of the American penal system and the flaws in its approach to rehabilitation. This was a story about power, control, and survival. And the men who lived it would never forget what happened inside those walls. The men who ran Tamms, life in solitary confinement. Behind the steel gates of Tamms, there was no room for weakness. The men who were housed here were not just violent criminals, they were the ones who had defied every attempt at reform, the ones whose brutality had earned them a permanent place in the bowels of America's prison system. When you're thrown into solitary confinement, every hour, every minute, stretches into an eternity. But for the men in Tamms, it wasn't just about surviving the day. It was about holding on to something deeper, a sense of power, of control, something to remind them they were still alive, still capable of bending the world to their will. These were the leaders of the most feared gangs in the United States, the Aryan Brotherhood, the Mexican Mafia, the Black Guerrilla Family, and others. Each gang had its own codes, its own way of surviving, even in isolation. Despite the prison's best efforts to separate them, the leaders still managed to command their forces from their cells. Take the case of Rafael El Diablo Guzman, a member of the Mexican mafia who had been sentenced to life without parole for a series of violent murders. According to reports, Guzman's gang ties didn't end when he stepped into the concrete box of Tams. No, if anything, that was just the beginning. Even locked away in solitary, Guzman was orchestrating operations from inside. He used coded messages smuggled through legal papers, letters passed between visitors, and even family members who worked on the outside to carry out his orders. His network of drug dealers and extortionists continued to thrive, making millions even with the prison's highest walls. It wasn't just the Mexican mafia. The Aryan Brotherhood, a white supremacist gang, had a similar hold on Tams. The Brotherhood had a long history of violence, and its members had been incarcerated for their numerous crimes across the U.S. But even in isolation, the Brotherhood remained powerful, using a network of white inmates to maintain control over prison economies and to continue their operations outside the prison walls. Men like William "Billy" Hawkins, a key player in the Brotherhood, had made a name for themselves in the world of crime long before they were locked away, and they continued to rule through fear and intimidation. Solitary confinement wasn't just a tool of punishment at Tams, it was the perfect breeding ground for the survival of these gangs. With little to do but think, these men were free to scheme, to plot, to organize. The prison's design was supposed to isolate them from each other, but in reality, it only gave them the space they needed to develop an even greater sense of power. Tams became a hub for underground activity, a place where whispers and rumors flew faster than the guards could act. Gary "the Bull" Williams, a notorious hitman for the Black Guerrilla family, understood this better than anyone. Williams had been serving a 50-year sentence for multiple murders when he was transferred to Tams. But even in the confines of a small concrete box, he continued to make his presence known. Williams had a network of supporters inside, all of them loyal to his cause. He was the man they feared, the one who controlled the chaos behind the prison walls. And the outside world. He still had connections. He made sure that his reach extended far beyond the prison gates. But not every inmate at Tams was a kingpin or gang leader. The prison also housed those who were merely pawns in a much larger game, men who had been caught up in the violent world of these gangs, and who found themselves trapped by the system. In Tams, there were no second chances. Once you were in, it was nearly impossible to escape the life you had built on the outside. In fact, the very nature of the prison system, and of Tams specifically, ensured that there would always be a cycle of violence, even in solitary confinement. For these men, survival wasn't just about enduring the punishment. It was about finding ways to keep themselves from losing everything, their power, their identities, their will to fight. And in the bleak, gray cells of Tams, survival often meant something darker. In a place designed to strip them of everything, some inmates became more dangerous, more powerful, more feared than ever before. The isolation led to madness in many, but for others, it was a kind of sharpening, a honing of skills and tactics. Tams was a prison of extremes, where sanity was tested daily, but where even in the most confined space, violence still thrived. The result? A society within a society, a world of its own, where every move was calculated, and every slip-up could be the difference between life and death. But for all the danger inside, the real violence of Tams wasn't just physical, it was psychological. The mental toll of solitary confinement turned the most hardened criminals into shells of their former selves. For some, it pushed them to the edge of insanity. The lack of human interaction, the complete absence of meaningful contact, twisted the minds of even the most resilient. Prisoners began to experience symptoms of severe depression, hallucinations, and emotional breakdowns. These were men who had been hardened by violence, but now they were breaking from the inside out. Reports from former inmates paint a haunting picture. They describe a place where every minute felt like an eternity, where your only company was the sound of your own heartbeat. And yet, amid the suffocating isolation, the gangs continued to thrive. The men who ran Tams weren't just surviving, they were taking control of their surroundings, manipulating a system that was supposed to break them. And they were succeeding. The battle for Tams, outside forces and legal challenges. The walls of Tams may have been designed to keep the world out, but over time, the truth about what was happening inside seeped through those very cracks. As the prison's reputation grew darker, so too did the attention it received from human rights organizations, lawmakers, and the media. What began as a remote, almost forgotten prison in the Illinois wilderness soon became a focal point for a nationwide debate on the use of solitary confinement and the ethics of Supermax prisons. The outcry started small but grew louder. It wasn't just the psychological toll on the inmates that stirred the public's conscience, it was the undeniable fact that the men inside Tams were being treated as less than human. Stories began to circulate about the inmates' mental health deteriorating, about their growing inability to function outside the confines of their cells. Prisoners were speaking out, telling tales of their days spent staring at walls, counting the seconds, until their minds would fray and splinter. The American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, took the lead in the legal battle against Tams. The group had long argued that prolonged solitary confinement was a violation of constitutional rights, specifically the Eighth Amendment, which prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. Tams, with its 23 hours of isolation each day, became the poster child for their argument. The ACLU wasn't just fighting for the inmates, they were fighting to stop a system that was slowly crushing the spirit of the incarcerated. Their claims were clear: such conditions weren't just punitive, they were torture. In 2007, the ACLU filed a lawsuit against the Illinois Department of Corrections, citing the inhumane conditions at Tams. They argued that the solitary confinement at Tams violated both the inmates' mental and physical well-being. According to medical experts who later testified, the extended isolation led to symptoms of psychosis, severe anxiety, and even suicide. One inmate, who had been placed in solitary confinement for nearly a decade, was reported to have developed symptoms of extreme paranoia and auditory hallucinations. His situation was far from isolated. According to court filings, several other prisoners exhibited similar symptoms. But it wasn't just the ACLU who pushed back. Mental health professionals, some of whom had worked with prisoners at Tams, began to speak out. They claimed that the prison's policies were directly responsible for the rapid deterioration of inmates' mental states. It's not just the isolation, one psychiatrist explained in an interview. It's the fact that these men have no hope. They are told every day that they are beyond redemption, and they begin to believe it. Despite the mounting evidence of the harm being done inside, the Illinois state government stood firm, arguing that Tams was necessary for maintaining control over the most dangerous criminals in the state. They contended that the Supermax facility was designed to hold men who couldn't be contained in any other prison. The state claimed that Tams was a critical tool in their fight against gang violence, a final solution for criminals who had proven themselves too violent for general population prisons. But even the state's own reports told a different story. The Illinois Department of Corrections conducted an internal review of the facility and, in 2010, found that nearly 40% of inmates at Tams showed signs of severe mental health issues due to prolonged solitary confinement. While this report wasn't publicly released initially, it found its way into the hands of reporters, who began to question the true cost of maintaining the prison. By now, Tams had become a political hot potato. The debate over its existence polarized lawmakers and prison reform advocates alike. On one side were those who believed that solitary confinement was a necessary tool to control the most dangerous criminals. On the other were those who argued that it violated basic human rights and led to irreversible psychological damage. In 2012, the Illinois state legislature passed a bill that called for the closure of Tams. It wasn't an immediate victory for reformers, but it was a significant step. The prison's existence was now officially in question. As debates raged, the public began to turn against the prison system's use of solitary confinement. What had once been seen as a necessary evil was now viewed by many as a form of state-sanctioned abuse. Meanwhile, inside Tams, life continued much as it had. Despite the growing awareness of the issues within, the gangs still maintained their stranglehold over the facility. Men like Rafael Guzman and Gary Williams continued their operations undeterred. As the outside world pushed for change, the inmates inside kept their eyes on the prize: survival, power, and control. The closure of Tams, which would eventually occur in 2013, came not as a sudden collapse but as part of a series of reforms aimed at reducing the use of solitary confinement in Illinois. The decision to shut down the facility came after years of mounting pressure from human rights groups, lawmakers, and the public, who demanded a more humane approach to incarceration. For the men who had spent decades in isolation, the closure of Tams wasn't just the end of a prison. It marked the beginning of a new chapter. Many of the gang leaders who had been housed there were transferred to other facilities, but some would never fully recover from the mental toll Tams had taken on them. The brutal regime of isolation had changed them in ways that couldn't be undone. Even with the closure of the prison, the scars left by Tams would linger long after its gates were shut for good. The story of Tams is one of tragedy, controversy, and, ultimately, a call for reform. It exposes the dark side of the American penal system, the ways in which punishment can go too far, and the consequences of dehumanizing those who are locked away in the system. But it also serves as a reminder of the power of outside forces, the human rights advocates, the lawmakers, and the public, who can stand up against injustice and demand change. As Tams became a distant memory in the history of the U.S. prison system, its legacy lived on, serving as a grim example of the extremes to which the government had gone in its pursuit of control. And for the men who survived its walls, the battle for their humanity would never truly be over. The aftermath of Tams, legacy, reform, and a system on trial. When the gates of Tamms Correctional Center closed for the final time in 2013, it wasn't just the end of a prison. It was the end of a chapter in the American justice system, one that highlighted the darker side of mass incarceration. The closure, while hailed as a victory by human rights advocates, left behind a lingering question: had the damage already been done? In the years following Tamms' closure, the debate over solitary confinement grew louder. The facility's haunting legacy forced the entire nation to reckon with its approach to the most dangerous criminals. What happened inside Tamms wasn't just an isolated incident, it was a symptom of a larger problem within the U.S. penal system: the overuse of isolation, the lack of effective rehabilitation, and the unchecked power of gangs behind bars. For those who had spent years, or even decades, in the suffocating silence of Tamms, the aftershocks of their experiences were impossible to ignore. Men who had been subjected to the harshest conditions imaginable found themselves facing an uncertain future. Some would be transferred to other Supermax prisons across the country, while others would be released into society, their minds scarred by years of isolation. But no matter where they ended up, the effects of Tamms would remain with them, haunting their every step. For former inmates like Gary Williams and Rafael Guzman, the battle for power never truly ended. The gangs that had thrived in Tamms didn't simply disappear when the prison's doors closed. They adapted, regrouped, and found new ways to maintain control over the prison system and the outside world. The fear and intimidation tactics that had been perfected inside the walls of Tamms were now being used in other facilities. The men who once ran Tamms from their solitary cells had now set their sights on new prisons, new networks, and new opportunities to dominate. But even as the gangs adjusted, the prison reform movement found new ground. With the closing of Tamms, reformers turned their attention to the remaining Supermax prisons still in operation across the U.S. They pushed for greater transparency, stricter oversight, and more humane conditions for inmates in solitary confinement. What happened at Tamms served as a stark reminder of what was at stake, and it galvanized efforts to overhaul a system that had been built on the idea that punishment was the only answer. In Illinois, lawmakers began taking steps to reform the prison system, driven by the lessons learned from Tamms. The state's decision to close the facility was followed by a reduction in the use of solitary confinement in other prisons, though the practice has not been fully eradicated. Even now, some of the most dangerous criminals are still placed in solitary, but the conditions and duration are now more closely scrutinized. Outside of Illinois, the closure of Tamms had a ripple effect. National organizations like the ACLU and Human Rights Watch took the victory and used it as a springboard to advocate for changes in federal prisons. They lobbied for limits on solitary confinement, especially for vulnerable populations such as juveniles and mentally ill inmates. They called for reforms that focused on rehabilitation, mental health care, and the eventual reintegration of inmates back into society, rather than just punishing them for their crimes. In some ways, the closure of Tamms marked a turning point in how the country viewed its prison system. The idea of mass incarceration began to be questioned more openly, with a growing recognition that a system designed to punish could, in fact, create more harm. It wasn't just about locking up the worst of the worst anymore, it was about understanding the long-term consequences of how they were treated. However, despite these reforms, many critics argue that the system is still far from fixed. In the years since Tamms' closure, reports have shown that solitary confinement is still widely used across the U.S., with thousands of inmates subjected to prolonged isolation. While the situation at Tamms may have improved, the legacy of its practices continues to haunt the American prison system. For the men who were held there, the battle didn't end with the prison's closure. James "Little J" Harris, an inmate who had spent over 15 years in solitary at Tamms, struggled with the mental health toll of his confinement long after his release. According to his own account, he had been placed in solitary as a teenager, and by the time he was transferred out, his mind had shattered under the weight of constant isolation. "I wasn't the same person when I came out," he said in a 2015 interview. "I was broken. I didn't know how to be around people anymore." But even as the effects of solitary confinement were laid bare, the systemic issues continue to persist. The prison industrial complex in the United States still operates on the same principles that led to the creation of Tams: more prisons, more punishment, and more control. The promises of reform often fall short in the face of budgetary constraints, political will, and a society that continues to demand harsher punishments. The real question now is not whether solitary confinement will continue, but what the future of the U.S. prison system will look like. Will reformers succeed in creating a system that prioritizes rehabilitation and human rights, or will the system remain rooted in punitive practices that ignore the mental toll of confinement? Tams may have closed its doors, but the debates it sparked are far from over. The lessons learned from that prison are a reminder that when we lock people away, we have a responsibility to ensure that we're not just punishing them, but actually preparing them to reintegrate into society. If that's ever a possibility. For the men who once roamed the cells of Tams, their legacy is one of pain and survival, but also of something more powerful: the reminder that the battle for humane treatment never ends.